Hi, I'm McKay, and today we're going to be talking about Niccolò Machiavelli's The Prince. First published I say published, but really it wasn't. It came out into the world in 1513, but it wasn't actually officially published until 1532, so 19 years later. 5 years after Machiavelli's death. So he didn't have a clue what it was going to do throughout history, and even up until this point, 500 years later. So how I'm going to approach this is to talk about the beginning, the points I liked, and my overall conclusions, I suppose. So the beginning, or introduction if you will, which I think is important to remember whilst you're reading it, is that Machiavelli wrote this manifest, or how-to guide if you will, to a certain Lorenzo di Medici, who was a member of the family that was ruling Florence at the time. And so it was only meant for his eyes and his eyes only. It wasn't supposed to be a public domain, everyone knew about it kind of thing. And overall, I'm not actually sure, or it isn't confirmed, if Lorenzo even actually read the fucking thing, which is a crying shame because he missed out on a manifest of utter truth. Because for me, Machiavelli is up there with Nietzsche for the most misunderstood and misinterpreted philosopher in history. Even the term now, Machiavellian, is kind of making me doubt how people really think of Machiavelli, because overall, yeah, there are elements in the book that do make you wonder a little bit about his ethics. But at the same time, he also outlines the fact that there's no place for fucking morality in a lot of these situations. And if you're going to be a ruler of men and of kingdoms, then you've got to kick that shit to the side at times. Of course, it's better to actually try and be good and aim for the right goal and right road to take and all that kind of stuff. But there's moments that history demonstrates, which he does throughout the text, where it doesn't actually apply, and morals have to kind of take a sidestep for decision making and pragmatism. Because really this is what the whole handbook, if you will, is all about. Pragmatism. That's the main message of it overall, how to approach these situations, which are applicable to your life. I don't think you should read it thinking they're not, because it isn't obvious that you can apply this because you're not a prince, for instance, you're not a ruler of men. But if you're a businessman, or if you're in a relationship, you have a family, because it doesn't matter if in the latter, for example, it's irrelevant if they're poor, rich, dysfunctional or stable. There is a political element to it, and you play a role within that. And of course you're part of the dynamics that construct the whole thing. And to think that you're not is just ignorant, and I believe it will lead you into a very depressed state in the future if you don't see it that way. The most famous quote from it is that it is better to be feared than loved, because love invites criticism and yearns for change or potential change, whilst fear actually keeps people in their fucking place. But so whilst it's better to be both, it's very hard to obtain, and if you had to choose between one of the two, it is obviously better to be feared. Which I still think is true, and I still think holds a lot of poignancy and a harsh truth, if you will, over the kind of nature of man and how he's viewed and how to control him, or at least get him to behave the way in which you might want him to. But for me, the most enlightening quote throughout it, and I think is the underlying message of The Prince in general, which says,
"How we live is so different from how we ought to live, that he who studies what ought to be done rather than what is done will learn the way to his downfall rather than to his preservation."
Which, in a roundabout way, he's saying that we all look at the world in a certain way and we picture it the way we want to see it. And that is usually an illusion. And we can't afford ourselves to view it in this particular way, because it's one, dangerous, and two, it's completely naive. It's like And I do think that's very true. It's like looking at the harsh reality of man and his position and the circumstances in which he finds himself. You can't really just favour an illusion or a kind of fantasy. And don't think this is easy. It's not. It's very difficult to really see things for how they are because one, basically no one does anyway, but to really get to grips with the reality of your situation is one of the most important factors that you need to keep in mind. And I think that, for me, is what his overall message is, or at least that's what I'm taking from it this read around. I read it maybe 6 or 7 years ago now, and although I enjoyed it thoroughly as an historical text and found it very informative, and at times even lightly amusing in a dark way, I didn't get anywhere near as much of it as I did this time around, where I was actually felt like pumped from reading it and quite like, fuck yeah, this guy is a genius. And he really is as well. I think it's odd that I never read any kind of critic say that he is a psychologist as well as a philosopher of kind of political science, because Machiavelli knew the nature of man better than most, I would say, and he really saw through their bullshit. So sticking to that theme, another quote and part I particularly enjoyed was when Machiavelli said, "Everyone sees you for how you appear to be, but very few see you for what you really are." And I would dare to go further and say that no one really sees you for what you really are, including yourself, which is another reason I think you can't really trust anyone else, because how can you if you can't even really know yourself overall? And how I think that is relevant in day to day is like, for a kind of small time example, if you go out wearing a suit, people treat you differently. There is an element of respect that is unearned just because you're wearing a suit, and you just have an appearance. That's the kind of point in a light way he's making as well. It's like you can manipulate it, and to think that you're not manipulating your way into getting what you want in general is ignorant, I would say, and it's just a different version of persuasion, really. We all manipulate. A child that learns its mother comes a-running when it starts crying quickly cottons on, and I can bet about 50% of the time from there on out he does that. It's bullshit, and he's just trying to get something from the tall woman who gives him things. And that's how he does it, because one, kids are limited by the language at that early stage, and because of that, secondly, they have to use their behaviour in order to get what they want, i.e. manipulate the situation and therefore obtain their goal. The people who label this book as kind of evil in a sense and, immoral, I don't really see where they're coming from in a lot of senses, because unless you've actually read the book, you will see that Machiavelli doesn't actually recommend to do any of the things he depicts throughout it. He's just given you demonstrations through historical examples. So he's saying, like, this is how this person controlled the people, and he did it in a very violent and aggressive way by basically assassinating the whole family line and therefore deleting them from history so he could obtain his power and keep it. But he does actually demonstrate that that isn't a great way to go about things, because you're obviously going to build up a lot of resentment. Yeah, you might get the fear element, but you also get the kind of a fear that could very easily trickle into hatred. And once the people hate you, you're fucked. So that's the last thing you want. And he's not really saying it in a sense that that's what you should do if you're in this situation. He's just giving you this example. But he does say, some moments in life, and none of us get to escape this, call for moments of evil. And that's true. And I'm not saying that it would involve something like murder or the kind of taking away of someone else's freedom or consent or whatever. But there are moments where you have to make fucking dark decisions and cut someone out, essentially. And throughout a business, that's going to happen throughout your whole career. So that's how it can be applied in that regard. And it's the same with anything. I mean, it's very difficult to change a family dynamic, but if you want to, you have to be willing to ostracize yourself, which again can point to the fact that you probably need to focus more on how you appear to other people rather than what you really are doing, because people are suckers, which is kind of what he's saying. I'll try and stop myself going too vitriolic throughout this, but yeah, for my money, all he's really doing is demonstrating the harsh truths of the nature of man, and kudos to him for that. Some critics went on about the fact that, you know, he shot himself in the foot by writing this manifest, because it, you know, for someone to engage in these tactics and be open about it, it's therefore admitting to his own wrongdoings and evil and kind of sinister nature. But we have to remember the fact that he only wrote this for one person. And obviously, if you are engaging in these kind of tactics, it is probably wise not to be open about it. But people are in general anyway, and I think in a subconscious way. It doesn't matter. There's always kind of manipulation and kind of how can I get more out of this situation kind of thing going on within any group. If you look at a rock band that's just starting up, there's a dynamic within that straight away, and egos are getting involved and clashing, and people in general are they're conspiring against you. That's how it works. It's fucking human nature. It's like, I think people who actually criticize things for being immoral are probably the most fucking corrupt people around, and they use their morals as badges of honor, when really it's just a pussy way of disguising their own cowardice, which is a kind of roundabout thing that Robert Greene says in a lot of his books. But yeah, people who preach are normally the most corrupt and immoral people around, so always be suspicious of them. Which moves me on to the final part I really liked, is when he talked about flatterers and how you should always avoid them. Because people who fluff you up and make you feel good and generally placate a load of bullshit to you just in order to make you feel happy are probably the most manipulative and deceiving people you could ever hope not to meet. And they'll deliberately do that in order to manipulate you later on, when they clearly haven't been taking their responsibilities seriously, for an example, but you feel guilty for giving them shit because they've obviously in the past been buttering you up the whole time. So there's a very kind of like sinister nature to the whole thing. And if you can find people who are going to tell you the truth, which is what Machiavelli advises, then that's what you should really look for. Look for harsh truth, but also be wary of when to actually ask for it, to make sure you're actually looking to the right people at the right time, and for people that you can trust. And although I've kind of contradicted myself slightly there, it's not necessarily that you can trust them, but more that you can trust their word with certain things, at least for a time. So yeah, that's what I think's brilliant about the piece. I suppose in a final conclusion, there are some other theorists that think the whole thing is satire. I, for one, do not at this point. I might change my mind about that in the future, but I don't think it is. I think it is a genuine kind of handy book, if you will, that is just giving you kind of brutal realities within mankind, and especially within groups of people, that has since been proven anyway. There's a reason this book has stuck around for so long and is still used by businessmen and politicians who still keep it at their bedside table. It's because it is applicable to many situations. It just depends on how you look at it. For further reading, I would thoroughly recommend Robert Greene, The 48 Laws of Power or 33 Strategies of War. They kind of go into it in a more modern view, but the more I've read this one, it's actually like, as long as you've got a good translation. This one is by Peter Constantine, and it's very good. I really enjoyed it, and it gives you little kind of footnotes to the references Machiavelli makes, and to sometimes the historical relevance of the points he's making as well. So yeah, overall I thoroughly recommend it. I think it's something that I will be reading at least once a year from here on out, because once you're out in the real world and you get caught up in the nonsense of day-to-day existence and the stupid politics that people conjure up, it's very easy to lose sight of the reality of things and of what is really going on. And because you can be roped into things without even really realizing it, having a book like this around actually really helps and really guides you a lot of the time. And that's what I really take from it. And I think it's a masterpiece, really. I think it's there's something really special about it, especially considering it was just written for one man as a gift. And it feels like it was a gift for many a person. And yeah, that's it, really. That's how I view it, and that's how I think it should be viewed. Don't take it all as a fucking factual thing as well, or at least all as a guide. It's more examples of how certain situations call for certain measures. And that's all I can really say about it, to be honest. I think people who look at it and go, oh, it's, you know, I think the word Machiavellian does have incorrect connotations, although it does obviously work. The interpretation itself is a bit unfair, because I don't really see, some people still think, you know, Machiavelli seemed like a bit of a douche or an arsehole or whatever. I don't really see that, to be honest. I just saw him as a more of a kind of no bullshit kind of guy who favours pragmatism and logical thinking rather than just windful hope. And I think that's much more admirable. So yeah, that's it. The Prince. It's a fucking masterpiece. There's a reason it's stood the test of time. It's fucking 500 odd years old now, and it will continue to be relevant as long as this species still exists. Fact. Pick it up. If anyone's interested, over on the Patreon page, I've just done a review of Styx, which is by Carl Edward Wagner, or Wagner, and it's a short story that had a massive influence on True Detective. They use a lot of the imagery within it, and that's the reason I've reviewed it actually, and found out about the story in general. And I really enjoyed it, and I've reviewed it recently. So yeah, if you want to head on over to my Patreon page and check it out, see what you might be missing out on. It costs you like $3 a month to pledge, and that's fucking nothing, is it? So why not come along and show your support and keep this channel going. I apologise if I've been sweating throughout this as well. It's fucking hot, so yeah, you understand. But yeah, that's it from me. Thank you very much for watching. If you do want to head over to Patreon, check out what's been going on, I'd appreciate it. And until then, I'll see you next week. Thanks very much. Bye.